I don't know how many of you have made a trip to your local bookstore anytime in the last decade, but if you have, then you've probably noticed that writing isn't really what it used to be. What does that mean, you ask? To be clear, what I'm talking about here is prose itself, not the content of the books, not the stories that they're telling, but the prose, the language with which the story is being told. Clarity, imagery, flow, the command the writer has of the English language, and so on. Bad prose in modern books takes many forms. The writing itself can be horrendous, but even when it's not, even when the writing isn't actively punching you in the face every other sentence, it all still just kind of reads the same, like the same person wrote it all. If you've ever received a work email sprinkled with emojis, then you might have found yourself scratching your head. Or maybe not. Maybe such occurrences are so commonplace now that you barely notice them. I personally have seen numerous articles online explaining the professional number of emojis one may use in work emails, so maybe I'm just behind the curve. If you own a smartphone, chances are you've got a Grammarly keyboard or some other AI typing assistant that automatically double-checks your grammar and your wording and suggests alterations. If you've spent any time in contact with the digital world, then chances are you've come across blocks of text that were absolutely written by someone leaning hard on their AI writing assistant, which admittedly isn't quite the same as using AI to write, but it nevertheless presents the same lack of humanity and lack of clarity. And also, more to the point, it presents the same core problem. Call me a Luddite, call me old-fashioned, call me whatever you like, but this strange reliance on machine aid in basic writing is very, very worrying. Not just because we are now apparently living in a world where books written to varying degrees with AI assistants are winning major prestigious literary awards, but mainly because this over-reliance on technology actually indicates that some kind of deficit already existed, which created a need for these artificial aids. That's something I want to make very clear. AI writing is absolutely killing aspiring writers' ability to put together stories and prose on their own. But there's a reason people immediately found AI assistants so tempting and appealing. The problem with writing already existed. AI just offered an artificial solution. There's a reason people are leaning so hard on their Grammarly keyboards. There's a reason people go straight to Chat GPT when they want to write a novel or a poem or a sweet text to the girlfriend. Okay, there are a lot of reasons, but a big, huge commonality in all these reasons is this. People no longer know how to write. And even when they try, even when we give them awards for doing so well, arguably, they cannot write well. Not anymore. Writing well is a dying art. My question is, why? If you want to figure out why people can't write well, can't express or articulate themselves anymore, you have to go all the way back. The first wave of damage that has been done to the minds of would-be writers occurred in elementary school. I would assume that very few writers starting out these days learn to read using phonics, although you do see phonics implemented a little more these days, but never exclusively and never without the added damaging hindrances of whole language, which we'll get into in a little bit here. But even if Gen X and the millennials did eventually learn how to read, studies have shown that readers who learned using word association or whole language have less reading comprehension than those who learned using phonics. Again, give me a second, I'll talk about studies and sources in just a minute. Most casual readers I come across in my daily life don't know grammar. They don't know what it means to diagram a sentence. They don't know what it means to conjugate a verb or identify noun and verb agreement. Most people these days don't know how to spell. How many times have you seen those posts of girls talking about how much they love the smell of their boyfriend's colon? We've reached a point now where it's deemed elitist to know which their or your is the right one to use in a given context. Forget current year education, which I'm sure is atrocious. Even when I was in school, they had abandoned this focus in education. In place of what? I don't know. In the 2 years I was in public school, all we did was watch movies, learn about drugs, and glue small pieces of paper to larger pieces of paper. In 4th grade, they also learned how to put condoms on bananas. I'm not sure why 4th graders would need to know how to use condoms, but that's a subject for another day. My father had to teach me how to read himself using Hooked on Phonics in the summer between 1st and 2nd grade. Around the time my father figured out how ludicrous and pointless school had become, he pulled me out and homeschooled me. I managed to achieve a pretty high reading level pretty quickly by nothing more than a little spiteful tenacity and my father's hard work. We definitely need to avoid meaningless excuses like privilege and elitism. Oppression and elitism is not why I couldn't read in the second grade. Privilege is not why I graduated from high school 10 years later with a 4.0 GPA. My family was not wealthy and had to work all the time like everyone else's families, and yet with some help, I still managed to figure out how to read and how to identify parts of speech. So instead of talking about privilege and victimhood, let's talk about facts. I know some of you hate that word, but I'm sure you can cope. So here are some nice, light facts to start with. The question is, why can't anyone write well anymore? There are a lot of reasons behind this, but we're going to focus our attention today on what is by far the biggest: education and critical literacy. Okay, first of all, I know how much you all love sources, and for today's topic, I'll concede. This data isn't all widely known. Therefore, I've compiled a huge list of sources explaining the literacy controversy, explaining the superiority of phonics, and also, if you're interested, how, billionaire industrialists and also the actual government, if you'll pardon my tin hat, deliberately undermined the education system of America over 100 years ago. I put all this together on my website. There's a link in the description. When I first heard the term critical literacy, I was foolish enough to assume that it meant literacy that involved the ability to think critically and to analyze the meaning of the text by one's own power. Turns out, I was wrong. Critical literacy is defined as learning to read and write as part of the process of becoming conscious of one's experience as historically constructed within specific power relations. Critical literacy moves the reader's focus away from the self in critical reading to the interpretation of texts in different environmental and cultural contexts. Further, critical literacy provides opportunities for readers to determine their ability to discern the purpose of texts and also their ability to identify ideologies presented in the texts. As they read, individuals can accept, reject, or reconstruct the ideologies presented in the text to support their own life experiences. We're not going to dig into this yet, but I want you to keep these definitions in mind as we proceed. Critical literacy, as it is called, and as I have just defined, is the new literacy. Begun in spirit by Paulo Freire, and then more solidly presented by Ira Shore in his 1980 book, Critical Teaching in Everyday Life, critical literacy aims to teach not literacy, but rather a kind of social awareness, which was using teaching reading as a delivery method of sorts, as if reading was just the syringe and this right kind of social awareness was the real thing they wanted the child to receive. Let me show you one quote from this book that should pretty adequately illustrate critical literacy in action. Prior to scheduling classes, Freirean educators study the life and language of their prospective students. These sociological inquiries permit them to discover a small number of keywords from daily life called generative words, which will be used for both problematizing experience and for literacy teaching. The generative words like brick, rice, slum, or wealth suggest social themes around which consciousness can then be raised. The concept of critical literacy then infected the education world. Within 2 decades, it had been adopted by the US government as an aspect of ESL programs. By the 90s, it had quickly but completely become the new literacy. I have a couple quotes from Shore's book and the list of links on my website. If you're curious as to just how disturbing this is, have a read. When people in modern academic and education circles talk about literate kids or teaching literacy, this critical literacy is, to them, the ultimate sign of success. If they can produce a critically literate adult, then they've done their job. Before we get too deep into the effects of critical literacy, which is an extremely crucial aspect of the topic at hand, why no one can write anymore, we should first try to define actual literacy, that is, the ability to read, which of course is the twin brother of the ability to write. We also need to look at the way actual literacy has entered a sharp, alarming decline, which is, and I'll demonstrate this, directly linked to the implementation of critical literacy. That is, actual literacy began to decline when critical literacy became the goal. Defining literacy is a hot topic in education circles. It's divisive and somehow controversial. Even putting aside the jargon-heavy newspeak of critical literacy, the assessment of adults' ability to actually read text on a page or screen is a hot-button issue, which isn't hard to understand. As literacy rates in America drop, everyone's first honest instinct is, well, there must be something wrong with the quality of the education. I mean, education tends to reply with various bizarrely worded definitions of literacy as if to say, no, literacy is not in decline. What you're talking about isn't literacy. And then people start arguing about that, and then the whole issue becomes a pointless shouting match. So before we get into the rest of it, I want to attempt to talk about what literacy even means. I mean, a definition we can all agree on so that as we talk about this issue, we can all be on the same page, so to speak. Let's put aside all the jargon-heavy definitions that get thrown around by all the players. Instead, let's look at the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, PIAAC. Literacy is accessing, understanding, evaluating, and reflecting on written texts in order to achieve one's goals, to develop one's knowledge and potential, and to participate in society. This is still pretty jargon heavy, but I think we can manage. I do appreciate that they're at least extremely clear about what they mean by all these individual words. Personally, I greatly dislike this odd word accessing here. To my mind, one's ability to access written text is reading. They mean reading. But there is more to it, as you can see down here. Not just able to comprehend the text they are faced with, they can also reach out to texts that are relevant to their purposes and search passages of interest within those texts. Basically, then, access here means the ability not just to read texts, but also to know where to go and how to find texts on various topics. I would agree that that's another layer of illiteracy, especially for adults, one that is crucial to actual authentic critical thinking, not weirdo critical literacy, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. Nowadays, assessments such as the PIAAC also evaluate a person's ability to read and comprehend text while being inundated with peripheral distractions. That's certainly relevant, I think we can all agree. So what we're looking at here is how the PIAAC's assessments have proven that literacy, as they have defined it, is in sharp decline. This is important to establish. Actual real literacy is decaying in this country. That's a huge factor in a writer's ability to write, obviously. So the PIAAC studies literacy in adults across a number of areas and using a number of factors to gauge their assessments. This is a lot of data and not really the sole focus of this video, so I'll include these links with the rest. The bottom line is that the PIAAC assesses literacy at 4 levels, with the first level being a kind of kindergarten literacy that struggles with anything more complex than the instructions in the back of the mac and cheese box, and certainly can't handle peripheral distractions. According to the PIAAC, over 25% of adults in America score at or below level 1 literacy. Go ahead and rewind that if you need to, but let me say that one more time. Over 25% of American adults cannot read above kindergarten literacy, and that number is growing. But let's look at level 2. This level is important to our discussion because based on my own assessment, most published authors today are probably at this level. Level 2 literate adults can handle some limited distraction. They can read slightly longer text, even if it's across multiple paragraphs or even multiple pages. If it's simple text, they can also put together an interpretation of meaning, and they can connect the text on one page with the text on another. I personally would call this 3rd or 4th grade literacy. This group makes up about 29% of the population. Combined with level 1, these two groups account for almost 60% of American adults. Over half of American adults cannot read above a basic 3rd or 4th grade level and can only analyze what they've read in a limited sense, while also being extremely vulnerable to distractions. All right, that's all very interesting, and this data is quite fascinating to dig into if you've got the time. But what does the literacy level of the average American adult have to do with one's ability to write good prose? I mean, obviously there's a connection, but how specifically does all of this start to fit together? Surely, you might ask, these level 2 and slightly higher adults are not the ones out here winning Pulitzer Prizes. I mean, surely. To answer, I want to first talk about this study from just last year, 2024. They Don't Read Very Well, a study of the reading comprehension skills of English majors at 2 Midwestern universities. This highly talked about study wasn't just assessing the literacy of the average American, but of the average English literature major at 2 widely respected state universities. I won't get into all the details of this, but just so you understand what we're talking about, the study participants were instructed to read the first 7 paragraphs of Bleak House by Charles Dickens, a dense, beautiful section of descriptive prose, and then translate what they read into modern language, thereby demonstrating their understanding of the text. What they found was that 58% of the study's participants were at about level 1 literacy or slightly higher, which the study categorizes as problematic. They also summarized the major traits that made these readers problematic. They understood so little of the introduction to Bleak House that they would not be able to read the novel on their own. However, these same subjects also believed they would have no problem reading the rest of the 900-page novel. Problematic readers often described their reading process as skimming and/or relying on spark notes. I highly encourage anyone to read the rest of this study. It's very readable and presents some very unsettling facts without an ounce of bias. We'll come back to this study a little later. For now, just remember, 58% of these English literature majors who will go on to become English teachers at all grade levels or who will also potentially be writing their own novels cannot even comprehend the opening pages of Bleak House. Worse than that, however, they don't even realize that they don't understand it. They think they're doing just fine. They think they've understood it just fine, or weirdly, that it doesn't really seem to matter to them that they don't understand it that well. Closely related to this study is this article from The Atlantic. The author spoke to a number of university professors and several students and found that professors have had to adjust their expectations of their students. English lit majors can no longer be expected to read whole assigned books, but have to content themselves with assigned passages of books. Several of these college students, these young adults, have arrived on campus unaware that reading whole books would be required of them. Several told their teachers that they didn't know how to read a whole book. Let that sink in for a moment. I want you to remember that one, okay? In order to read a book, logic tells you that you read one word after another until there are no more words. Bam, you've read a book. But these students seem to think that reading a whole book is some special knowledge that they never received, a specific procedure that no one taught them. Remember that as we continue on here. So, we've probably pretty well established that literacy, as you and I and the PIAAC understand it, is so far in the toilet that it might not be salvageable in a single generation. Now, what about this elusive thing that came in to replace it, this critical literacy? This teaching manual for whole language from 1996 reads like one of those bizarre, esoteric, yet highly specific occult self-help manuals. It talks about the social aspect of language and other similarly Orwellian hot words instead of actually learning how to figure out what the words on the page say. One of the beginning strategies for teaching literacy with whole language, according to this manual, is the use of generative themes. You remember that one? Which all boils down to the most important thing about reading is learning the correct way to interpret a text, which, by the way, has nothing to do with the author's intent and is heavily reliant on your feelings. I mean, think about how so many people these days latch onto specific words and then spin out because those words trigger them in some way. That's because those words are generative words, which fit into generative themes, which are taught to them in a way specifically intended to trigger their emotional analysis. These people can't listen to reason at that point. They see the word and the programmed reaction is triggered, and that's it. That's what critical literacy produces, specifically and intentionally. As is evident in their own proudly stated definitions, the entire function of critical literacy is to teach children not how to read texts, but how to analyze them, or more precisely, how to analyze them correctly. That's an incredibly important distinction. Most children are taught to analyze texts before they're even taught how to spell words. Many children are never taught to spell words, they're just taught to analyze them. This concept, critical literacy, was the ultimate, final, ugly goal of a very long, arduous war that was waged specifically on phonics. Although, of course, phonics was only one battlefield in that war. The whole debate between phonics-based reading education and so-called whole language, which was the first form and forefather of critical literacy, is an ongoing, unresolved matter in the education community, sometimes called the reading wars. There is a lot of research that insists it makes no difference how you go about teaching kids to read. There is a lot of research pointing out that there is a marked superiority in reading comprehension and a whole host of other literacy skills when a child is taught using phonics. One of the many lines of debate in all this is whether or not children are born with a kind of latent ability to read and it merely needs to be activated. There's a ton of argument on both sides. In my opinion, this entire ridiculous, meaningless debate muddies the issue for the larger question. That is, what is the best way to teach good reading ability and habits to the average child. I say average because, of course, there will be outliers and there will be children who have difficulties, and different methods or even completely unique methods will have to be employed for them. But the bottom line is that according to the data, on average, phonics is best. Always has been, always will be. When I was a kid, everyone, even the teachers, knew phonics was better, but they had to do as they were told. I mean, I'm sure you already know, but schools don't get the government handout if they don't use the government-approved curriculum, and that includes a lot of private schools. I mention government-approved curriculum because the state-mandated education system we have now is a recent invention, and again, not really the focus of this video. It's worth noting, however, that in the early days, it was billionaire industrialists who bankrolled the entire concept of a federal education board. Previously, the idea that the state should have any control over the education of children was unimaginable. As I said before, this isn't the focus of this video, but it is an interesting aspect, especially given the fact that there is a startling amount of scholarship out there to support the claims made by some that the removal of phonics in public state-run schools actually intended to decrease or at least limit literacy, or, as we're perhaps seeing today, transform literacy into this other thing, this critical literacy. It's open knowledge that John Dewey, the guy who built the modern American education system, believed that education should be focused not on education, but on deliberate, calculated social formation. According to this book, which is stuffed with primary sources, the move away from phonics was intended to cut down on a person's ability to think critically and instead conform to, groupthink. Or, as we saw in the previous definition of critical literacy, becoming conscious of one's experience as historically constructed within specific power relations and moving the reader's focus away from the self. Here's the thing. And this isn't some tin hat conspiracy theory. This is a known fact that you can read about from the pens of the instigators themselves. The modern education system was not designed to teach children. When you pack up your kid with his little book bag and his lunchbox and you drop him off at school, he's not going to actually learn anything, except as a side dish to the primary function of education. Sure, he might be able to multiply, and if he's really bright, he might even be able to do long division and maybe even memorize all the state capitals. And they'll probably make damn sure he knows how to put a condom on a banana, but learning to read? This is a tad off topic, but I want to make this clear. When the education system in America was established and formed, it was done in an effort to socially condition children. The establishers and formers said so themselves on numerous occasions. To them, this was important. Children needed to be taught what to think. They needed to have their opinions formed very carefully. This is explicitly stated in many sources. But when they were doing this establishing and forming, one of the first things they did was throw out memorizing the alphabet and learning phonics. Why they chose to do this is something I'll leave to your own deductive reasoning. A few of the sources I have available also draw their own fairly obvious conclusions. Do your own reading. The answer is there. The absolute disease that is the American public education system was, like it or not, specifically engineered to produce adults who were just literate enough to work at factories, about the 1 or 2 level according to the PIAAC. So looking at it that way, maybe the American education system, as designed and developed by John Dewey and co., isn't actually in decline. It's functioning exactly as intended. That is to say, to bring this back around to the context of our primary topic, the entire American education system has been deliberately built in such a way that good, beautiful, imaginative, personal writing is not only not a goal, it is actively discouraged. Removing phonics was just the first phase of this active discouragement, shifting children's focus away from figuring out or decoding words on their own and towards this hyperfixation on teacher-guided, that is state-guided, analysis prevents them from learning how to build their own personal critical thinking mental muscles. Those college students who don't know how to read a book are the direct result of this kind of education emphasis. Practically speaking, on the topic of the superiority of phonics, there is an overwhelming amount of scholarship Besides just simple analyses of the ways in which humans learn the English language or any phonetic language, there are also a lot of studies, including some enormous meta-analysis studies which collected and analyzed the data from hundreds and even thousands of literacy studies and found that yes, actually, phonics is significantly superior in teaching the simple, bare ability to read words on a page and understand what they mean. But I guess that's not nearly as important as teaching little first grade Johnny that actually no, everything written prior to current year is deeply problematic, and here's why. The takeaway here is that phonics has long been the only correct way to teach your average child how to read, mainly because English is a phonetic language, unlike, say, Mandarin, which uses characters that have certain specific meanings. Sure, you can learn to read using whole language or something else besides phonics, but adults who do manage to learn that way tend to have some deficits in their reading ability, which many aren't even aware of. Teaching English in the same way you would teach Mandarin is not a natural way to deliver that knowledge to the English-speaking brain. The brain doesn't operate as efficiently when it reads if it was taught to read using some method other than phonics. The brain's ability to analyze what it is reading is greatly hindered by this lack of efficiency. And as much as it is readily obvious that the average child, and many children with reading disabilities, fare miles better with phonics than any other method, it is also apparent that all the replacement methods have as their primary focus not actually learning how to read, but rather learning what they're allowed to think about what they read. It follows then that removing phonics is directly related to what seems to be a deliberate effort to create uniform, simple-minded working adults who have less than functional literacy and little interest in thinking critically. Learning this kind of intensively forced and rigid conformism is built into the American education system quite literally from day one. How can such a system be expected to produce a good writer, a genuine writer? Now let's look a little closer at how one thing, removing phonics and focusing on critical literacy, leads to the other, writers who can't write. First of all, what happens when you learn phonics versus learning whole word or whole language? I mean, neurologically in the brain, what happens? Fortunately, people have recently started to study just that. In 2015, Stanford professor Bruce McCandless carried out a study in which he and his team invented a fictional language and then taught it to some study participants using phonics, and then to others using whole language. Later, they were tested on the language while their brainwaves were being monitored. They found that the phonics learners were able to recognize the words they had learned in the blink of an eye, with the brain making instant connections with neural activity focused primarily in the left hemisphere, that is, the side of the brain most involved in logic, analytical thinking, and language processing, among other things. The same language test was then carried out with the whole language learners. When they were tested while their brain waves were being monitored, they were found to have longer delays in arriving at the memorized words and were unable to decipher or decode new words they hadn't yet memorized, which the phonics people could do. Much more interesting, however, was that their brain activity was focused far more primarily on the right side of the brain, the side most involved in art, feeling, creativity, and imagination. I hope Professor McCandless will forgive my making some generalizations here, but this study tells me that those who learn languages by some method other than phonics rely hugely on their feelings and, crucially, their imagination to determine and remember words and their meanings. As we all know, feelings and imagination are subjective, changeable, and prone to manipulation. We see this a lot with young adults throwing their weight around academic debates by shifting the definitions of words to fit into whatever it is they're trying to say, or tossing together a big word salad. A lack of precision in language leads to a lack of precision in writing. If a writer lacks precision, they will never be able to convey the actual thoughts in their head in a way that the reader will be able to understand. There are a lot of other fascinating studies and analyses being done on the neurological goings-on in the brain when learning to read, but something that seems overall consistent is that phonics trains the logical, critical thinking parts of the brain, while other methods tend to center on the emotional and imaginative parts of the brain. And also that phonics is far, far more efficient neurologically. Anyone who has ever tried to write anything will tell you that imagination is great when it comes to telling a story, but when it comes to prose, choosing the words with which the story will be told, precision is key. Precision and constantly growing vocabulary and the ability to think critically. all of which are hindered and even stunted when a non-phonics approach is used to teach reading. Now, because critical thinking is essential in literary pursuits, I shouldn't have to explain how much this stunts potential writers. But the ability to think critically, that is, in this case, read a paragraph and understand what all the words mean on their own, what they mean when they're put together, how they're being used to portray an idea or paint a picture, and so on, that's all part of critical thinking. Real critical thinking. Without critical thinking, all a person can do is read the paragraph and then let someone else tell them how those words come together and form an idea and so forth. And then they'll know what the paragraph means. This manifests constantly in daily life. Ask someone what they thought of the movie they just watched, and they'll be like, well, Rotten Tomatoes gives it a 62% fresh, so... Okay, yes, but what did you think of the movie you just watched? The general consensus on IMDb is that it's an above-average film. Ask a person what they thought of the book they just read, and they'll tell you what Twitter user 719 said. Ask a person if the restaurant they ate at last night was any good, and they'll tell you what the review in the Times said. Ask a person who they think they should vote for, and they'll start quoting the army of influencers who tell them what to think, probably using the same limited vocabulary of generative words. Things have gotten even more surreal and bizarre now. Now you ask your work friend if that book they're reading is any good and they fire up Chat GPT to get an answer. Now we're not even relying on other humans to tell us what to think, but machines. Machines which were designed and programmed by the new wave of billionaire industrialists. And no one thinks twice about it because they were raised from the crib to let others tell them how to analyze text. Before they were even taught their ABCs, they were taught that their own minds were not to be trusted to understand words on a page. And we wonder why feelings have become the only metric by which society can judge morality. Feelings are the only thing people were ever taught was legitimate or valid, which is why if you hurt someone's feelings, that is, to people trained in this way, infinitely worse than saying something that is factually inaccurate. No one thinks anymore. This is directly related to how they were taught to read. Let's put aside the fact that the current state of the American public education system is embarrassing, and the fact that SAT scores, despite endless massaging and padding, are still in the toilet. Even those who did manage to successfully learn to read in school and can now be counted among the literate citizens of this country did not learn actual authentic literacy, but this other weird Orwellian critical literacy. I want to go back now to that 2024 study I cited earlier, which assessed English Lit majors' ability to read Dickens. This whole study is very readable and brief. I highly recommend reading it if you're interested in the subject. But one of the most interesting areas that the study's organizers wanted to assess specifically was the actual way in which the readers obtained meaning from the passages. Only 5% of the 85 participants in this study were able to comfortably read and interpret the novel Bleak House accurately. That is, only 4 of the 85 people were able to read the words on the page and then tell the facilitators what those words meant accurately. As I said before, 58% were not able to even understand the individual sentences. These 58% were categorized as problematic readers and were described by the study's authors as lacking effective reading tactics. So much so that they couldn't comprehend the way syntaxes and clauses worked together and couldn't tie the meaning of one sentence to the next. Essentially, to 58% of the studied college-level English literature majors, Bleak House was gibberish. This is particularly evident when you read the transcripts of their reading sessions. 2 of the tactics used most often by these readers were oversimplification and guessing. One reader explained how she read the words first without really thinking and then tried to analyze them later. One said she never analyzed individual sentences, but rather looked at the general meaning of the whole thing. The other bad reading tactic these readers had was commenting. That is, these readers were instructed to translate Dickens' prose into exact modern words, but instead of doing that, they made general comments about what they thought of the text. All of this, these bad reading tactics, as I'm sure you remember, are the direct result of training kids in critical literacy. In reality, these students are performing exactly as trained. They're following the precise instructions they received when they were learning to read, and this is the result. 96% of these problematic readers said they were confused at least once. 57% ignored figures of speech. 41% interpreted them literally at least once. 92% used general personal commentary instead of explaining Dickens' actual prose as asked. Most guessed the wrong meanings of words they didn't know and then didn't bother to look them up. Some did look them up, but still couldn't figure out how the word worked in the sentence. and so on and so on. What interests me even more, however, is this 38% right here. 38% of the 85 study participants could understand the grammar and a fair amount of the vocabulary, but could not interpret the actual text. The study organizers called these students competent, which I personally think is a stretch. These are people who have a relatively advanced understanding of the English language, advanced enough to be able to follow the prose of a particularly eloquent passage of Dickens. Despite that, these competent readers did not understand what they were reading. The published study describes at length the specific ways in which these readers read, and one of the most compelling findings was that, as the authors themselves observed, these 38% were comfortable with their confusion. If they didn't know a word, they'd guess and move on without confirming, aware that they were moving forward without certainty as to meaning. They'd vaguely interpret something they didn't understand, shrug their shoulders or brush it aside, and move on. They were very often wrong. 96% defined words incorrectly. 46% skipped words they didn't know, like they weren't even there. There was a passivity to these readers. Despite being able to understand the English language on the page, despite being, as the authors of the study called it, competent readers, when they were done reading the opening passage of Dickens' Bleak House, they didn't even know that the passage that they had read involved lawyers and a courtroom. One transcript demonstrated how a reader read this passage. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. The subject then interpreted that two characters named Lord Chancellor and Michaelmas encountered an animal while they were walking down the street. She was satisfied with her interpretation. I want to make one thing very clear here. No one is mocking these students' lack of vocabulary knowledge. I have to look up words I don't know all the time when I'm reading. The biggest and most significant factor here, at least to me, is that these college undergrads didn't even bother doing that. They had permission to look up anything they didn't know, and they just didn't bother. They felt they knew the meaning, assumed they were right, and moved on. English majors at a major university. A point that I want to make sure you understand is that as alarming as this is, it's exactly critical literacy. Exactly. These students, most of whom self-reported getting A's and B's in English in high school, were demonstrating critical literacy. They could obviously read all the individual words just fine, and they were focused on using their feelings to guide broad interpretation of what the text might be conveying, and also were comfortable relying on sources like SparkNotes and Wikipedia to understand the meaning of the text. These two subject groups, problematic and competent, were demonstrating perfectly adequate critical literacy. It's worth noting that a decent chunk of these students intended to go on to creative writing. These students, all 85 of them, knew how to read. These students knew, when they looked at words on the page, what those individual words said. By the most basic metric in existence, their literacy was just fine. Almost all the studies that I found that claim that literacy was unaffected by the means used to teach it, this is the kind of literacy they're talking about. You look at the page and know what the words say. Yet, look at how little these educated adults can actually understand. More than that, look at how utterly unequipped they are to figure out how to understand what they read. These are adults who will go on to raise or teach or otherwise participate in the education and upbringing of the next generation of human beings. And also, it's worth adding, the next generation of writers. This fascinating 2023 article from The Atlantic, of all places, called attention to the fact that there was something very wrong with how educators have been teaching kids to relate to books. Children are being taught analysis according to the methods I've shown so far, methods which destroy organic, authentic critical thinking, long before they're simply given a book and asked to read it, which is to say that kids are first taught the right way to read a book, and then they are allowed, with supervision, to read parts of that book, and then their interpretation is assessed, and if found faulty, it is corrected. The author of this article had noticed that this has effectively destroyed a child's nascent love for reading before it even has a chance to develop. Think of how that relates to the readers who were assessed in that 2024 study. What else would you expect from training children to read in this way? Think about the students who say they don't know how to read a whole book. Of course they don't. If they're being taught in this way, they'll be conditioned to believe that reading a whole book is a matter of hyper-specific, highly regimented analysis, and if teacher isn't there to show them how can they possibly be expected to do it? These kids are being conditioned to be this way. What does this mean for writing? First of all, this means that writers are no longer writing what they think and what they perceive and what they intuit and even what they feel. Sure, they're writing what they're supposed to, and they're paying very close attention to generative themes and all those generative words like wealth and slums and, just as a reader, as trained by this system, has to consult some other source to tell them what the text they just read was saying, a writer trained in this way has to consult some other authority to make sure they're thinking and perceiving and intuiting and feeling the right things the right way. That is, that they are writing the right way. And it's not just that they want to conform, although that's a factor, it's that they have not been taught how to understand or even find meaning in text by their own authority and power. Never mind what this means for actual free expression and individual thought. There is zero room for creativity to grow organically within this. This means that now, when a writer looks at a sunset, say, they don't really spend much time thinking about the words and imagery they want to use to describe it themselves. They aren't, with their own grasp of the language and all its nuances, which authentic literacy would have taught them how to find and use on their own, constructing the imagery themselves with their words in their minds. They aren't feeling their own feelings and thinking their own thoughts. Even in a world where everything is feelings, none of those feelings are allowed to come from the person's own mind, but have to be fed into them like loading software into a computer. They aren't then able to take that word image and rearrange everything so it flows well, so it evokes the right emotion, so it settles into the imagery and atmosphere they're building, so it just sounds beautiful. No, that skill for them has only been cultivated outside genuine critical thinking, which means writers have not been equipped with the necessary skills to do these things on their own. They have no choice but to muddle through without even knowing what they don't know. Or they do exactly what their creative writing professor tells them to do. If you've ever wondered why all modern literary fiction reads the same, there you go. All right. There's one more thing I want to talk about really quickly, and that's this thing called prosody. Everything we've discussed prior to now has had to do with clarity and precision when writing. Now we're going to talk about beauty. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but this is something I think is very often overlooked when assessing an individual's potential literary ability. That is, their ability not just to read, but also to write. I personally believe good prosody is essential in writers. For the sake of clarity, I'll simplify this just a little. Prosody has to do with a person's inflection, rhythm, etc. while reading, mainly reading aloud. If a person has good prosody, that means that he or she understands and is able to use the rhythm and flow of words in a sentence to both interpret subtler meanings and to convey subtler meanings. So looking at this, you can see how this could also allow a person to both identify beautiful prose and also write it themselves. Good prosody means a reader can interpret the flow, rhythm, and meaning of the text. Flip that around to writing. If you have good prosody, you'll then be better equipped to build sentences that have good flow and rhythm, and use that flow and rhythm to add subtler meaning to those sentences. This study looked at adult readers who had grown up learning phonics and readers who had grown up learning whole language. They had comparable literacy, as we've discussed, but the phonics adults had much better prosody. What does this mean? Have you ever read a bit of Dickens or Hemingway or Waugh, Coolidge, Frost, etc., pick one, and been moved not just by the imagery of the descriptions, but also by the way the language itself seemed to have a musical quality? Obviously, this is more apparent in poetry, but let's look at prose. I'm going to read you one paragraph from a Pulitzer Prize-winning book from 1935 and one paragraph from a book that won the Booker Prize in 2023. I want you to listen not just to the words, anyone can write words, I want you to listen to the flow and rhythm of the words. I've chosen prestigious literary prize winners for this example because these prizes have as a prerequisite good prose. So a winner of such a prize should be said to have then, in some way, produced prose that wasn't just typical of its times, but also exceptional. This is Josephine Johnson's novel, Now in November, which won the Pulitzer in 1935. Now, we're not talking about content or what the book is about. None of that matters right now. All I want you to listen to is the rhythm and flow of the language. And then Karen's light went out, and I heard her move in bed, and the old haunting fear came back, a kind of dark stain over all other thoughts. We seemed to lie here, locked and coffined inside ourselves, and only Merle still free of the love or hate or fear that was shut inside. And it seemed to me, lying there in the dark, that the more I thought or read or saw, the more oppressive and tangled with choice life came to be. Not tangled in daily living, perhaps, but in the whole plan and pattern of it. The living itself was easy enough to do when the days were too full for thought, and clothes wearing down fast to bone, soaking up dirt like sponges. There was no question of what to do when it took 2 hours to get food ready for 15 minutes of eating, and no particular choice to make except between radishes and beans. But it was the meaning of all these evident things that still stayed hidden. Every new thought seemed to open a door, but when the mind rushed forward to enter, the door was slammed shut, leaving it dazed outside. I seemed often on the threshold of some important and clarifying light, some answer to more than the obvious things, and then it was shut away. Now this is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which won the 2023 Booker Prize. First Ben to creche, and then the children to school, Molly stepping from the passenger door of the Touran with headphones on while Bailey slams the back door. Eilish watching over her shoulder as he stands pointillist by the glass, pulling at his parka hood. She is moving out onto the road when a hand bangs on the window. Molly is shouting for her to stop. The door pulls open and Molly grabs her gym bag from the floor and is gone. The winter light, a cold November smear. She is moving through traffic, sensing her own exhausted emotion, her motions automatic. Resting at the red light, she sees not the day ahead, but how the day will pass without impression, another day forgotten and absorbed into the silent reckoning of days. Seeing herself at work, and how she no longer thinks of her work as a career. The real work of a microbiologist is standing at the bench for long hours seeking evidence, testing hypothesis against reality, against whatever an individual might seek to believe. The answer, true or false, is found in the result. Now she spends her days on email and phone, specialist become generalist without a white coat, managing personnel, adrift during meetings, asking the wrong questions. It should be evident here what I'm talking about. This isn't a matter of sentence length or vocabulary size. There is a natural flow to Josephine Johnson's prose that is completely lacking in Paul Lynch's. One reads like running water or pouring syrup. The other is interrupted, aborted segments of flow, arrested by cumbersome hitches in the rhythm of the sentences. An excellent example would be this sentence. The winter light, a cold November smear. She is moving through traffic, sensing her own exhausted emotions, her motions automatic. There is no flow here, no rhythm. It can be said that such a thing isn't necessary for a good book, or even for clarity and precision, of course. The point I'm making is that modern readers, and therefore modern writers, are no longer being taught how to read in a way that will, among many other things, allow them to detect and also to produce a beautiful rhythm in their prose. This came very naturally to almost any educated person in the days before these education reforms. I mean, look at this page from a Sears Roebuck catalog from 1945. Certain suit makers have a particular talent for turning out styles that do wonderful things for your figure. Certain mills produce the perfect fabric for this kind of suit. When you bring both together, you have something special. That's what happened here. Walther, an American mill famous for producing quality fabrics, loomed this velvety smooth Venetian covert specially for Sears Roebuck. And what suit was worthy of this fine fabric? Our supple, precisely fitted cardigan style. It's an ad, and it has better flow than 2023's Booker Prize winner. All right, that's all a tricky area, but if you're interested in expanding your thoughts on this idea, I invite you to open any old book, one that was written by a writer not subjected to these reformed ways of teaching, and read passages out loud. That's the best way to feel and hear this rhythm. Then do the same with anything you can find on a shelf at the bookstore published in this decade. Compare them and see what you think. Okay, we should probably wrap this up. We all know that there's something wrong with the current year average person's ability to write. We've reached this surreal dystopian point at which people everywhere seem to believe that using a machine to edit and adjust your writing style and flow, not to speak of the words and meaning, is not just normal, it's encouraged. I want to say this. If you want to be a writer, delete your Grammarly keyboard, your Grammarly Chrome extension, and anything else. If you have any other kind of AI assist on your phone or computer keyboards or word processors, turn them off or delete them. Do it now. I'm not even screwing around. Nothing, and I mean this, nothing is worse for your literary intelligence, critical thinking, and creative imagination than using AI in any way, shape, or form for your writing. What about the future? What about the next generation? What about all the kids and teenagers who will one day be writers and editors who are currently neck deep in critical literacy classes? What about that? Well, I don't know. Every person has to figure out what to do with their own situation. Me personally, I couldn't read until the 2nd grade when my father had to teach me phonics himself. And then he also pulled me out of public school and homeschooled me for as long as he could. Eventually, I finished my education in a small private school where I managed to graduate valedictorian. But even I still sometimes feel the effects of 2 years of whole language and look-say. Still, maybe I was lucky. If you have kids and you can homeschool them, do. Once you start looking into just how bad the American education system is, you'll start to get pretty angry, probably. It's bad. However bad you think it is, it's worse. Have a look at some of the books in the list if you want to see for yourself. People talk about this being a post-literate age, and that is, in many respects, completely true. But it's also fixable. The problem is it cannot happen at the institutional level. No one, especially not some random little YouTuber like me, is going to get the United States Department of Education to change how they teach kids to read. But what we can do is change how we learn to read and how we teach our kids to read. And then we can learn how to write, and we can teach our kids how to write, and we can educate ourselves with the unlimited resources that we have at our disposal. And we can ignore the terrible, worthless institutions and take charge of our own minds. At the risk of sounding like a guru, you're a human being with opposable thumbs and free will. Now go do something with it. Just a reminder, check out the link below if you want to see links to all the studies and articles I talked about, or if you want to browse some interesting additional information about the topics we discussed here. Secondary reminder, I've recently added some October recommendations to my bookshop store. You can check that out too. You can also use my affiliate link to buy anything you want from bookshop.com, even if it's not in my personal store, and it supports me and helps me keep making videos and maintain my, frankly, alarming coffee habit, and also Otto, obviously. Anyway, I know this was a long one, and I really want to thank you for making it to the end. I really appreciate all of you, and I want to thank you not just for watching, but also for always starting such interesting conversations in the comments. That's really something to see. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.